We're going to be going through the basic concept of creation, how creation happens constantly, how, in a sense, we exist within God, but there's godliness within every single thing in this world, how God remains singular and not multiplied, like everything in creation is multiple, is full of multiplicity, but God remains single. We'll understand how exactly that works, that we exist within God, but God remains one. So today's class is going to be all about creation. We're going to be talking about how God creates the worlds. And as I said, please don't hesitate to ask any questions in the comments. And we will begin with a saying from the Baal Shem Tov, a teaching of the Baal Shem Tov. Who is the Baal Shem Tov? The Baal Shem Tov was a scholar which lived over 300 years ago. And there's this verse which says, God's words are always in the heaven. What does that mean that God's words are always in heaven? So in order to understand that, let's take a peek into a teaching of the Arizal, which is a Kabbalist many years ago. If you're familiar with his channel, you'll see we spoke about the Arizal several times, one of the most fundamental Kabbalists. And he said that every single thing, even a daimim means something which is inanimate, like a stone, has a nefesh. A nefesh means a soul or a spirit of some sort. It has some sort of godliness within it. And what does this refer to? This refers to the godliness which is infused within everything. So we said that God's words are in the heaven, but they're not only in the heaven, they're in every single thing. God infuses this entire world with life, and God's life and energy from God to the world is constantly in the world. And as we will see, this world cannot exist without it. And the big question is why? Why can't this world exist without godly energy being constantly inside of it? Now, you might say, why not? Maybe the world should just be able to exist. God creates it once, and then, God continues to infuse it with energy. Why not? But we're told that no, God's energy is constantly in this world, and without it, the world would vanish. The world would cease to exist. So to understand this, we're going to go through a bit of a thought process to see how things work in our world, and then we'll see how perhaps things work from a godly creation perspective, and we'll see why we might have a bit of a harder time understanding that God's energy needs to constantly be creating us and constantly be in the world. So when we form a vessel, we need to change simply its form. When God creates the universe, he's creating its matter and substance. When we build anything in our human experience, we're taking something that exists, we're taking materials that already exist, and we're simply manipulating their composition. We're manipulating the way they're built, we're manipulating their structure, their shape, their color perhaps, but all of those things already exists. Even when we change something's color, the color already existed there, potentially. Just that we added it, we changed it, etc. But when God is creating something, it was not there before. It was just God, God's singularity, God's infinity. That's the only thing that was there before creation. God is creating something out of nothing. So when we as humans create something, we can go to the marketplace and the vessel will continue existing even without us. But with God, it's different. With God, the energy of God needs to constantly be creating and within this universe. And this we can understand from a mashal, which means an example or a metaphor from us throwing a stone. And this is from the Rebbe Rashab, a great scholar, Kabbalist, who also lived about not that long ago, 150 years ago about. And he says that this is, if we want to compare creation to anything in our human experience, it's not going to be like us creating even a phone, building a phone, or even creating an idea, or even a painting, or a song. You might think that a song, it's created out of nothing. This song never existed and I created it. But even that is not fully true because the notes existed. It's just that the composition of these notes hadn't existed. So what is something that perhaps we can get a bit of a grasp of what creation is really like with God? When we throw a stone, our energy remains in that stone to take it up during its entire flight. The second our energy begins to diminish, the stone begins to fall back down. This is perhaps something that can give us a glimpse into understanding how God creates the world. God is creating the world from nothing. And therefore, God's energy needs to remain constantly within this physical existence. And I'm not sure if you're being disturbed by the rain sounds, but it is raining outside. So I hope that's fine with everybody. Stone's nature is to fall. It can only fly up with the energy and power of man, which escorts it throughout its journey. And the same thing is with God's creation of this world. There's constantly godly energy within this world. And we did just put out a video not too long ago about explaining 4 different levels of how we can understand this concept of how God is constantly creating this world and constantly infusing it with energy. There's 4 different stages of how exactly we can put this together in our minds. So what does this really mean? What this really means is that God's energy is constantly in this world, infusing it with existence. Let's just reflect on what we're saying. We're saying that this universe is something physical, and God is creating it out of nothing and constantly infusing it with energy. And eventually, we're going to see how this plays into the entire Kabbalistic map of spiritual realms, what all the Sephirot and all the different worlds have to do with this process of creation. So let's get back into our class. So we said that God's energy is constantly infusing this world with everything. But the question is, what is that godly energy? So in order to understand this, let's think about sun rays coming from the sun. What are sun rays? Sun rays are simply an expression coming out of the sun. The sun is so powerful, the sun is full of heat, the sun is full of photons, the sun is full of all this power and energy, and therefore it emits these particles of energy, these photons, this light. It comes out of the sun automatically because the sun is so powerful. It's a reflection of what the sun is. So in a sense, we can think of the energy of God in a similar way. What is God's energy? God's energy is an expression of God. It's simply the power coming from God in order to express and create all of creation. But the difference is that with the sun, and we will be getting into this energy and we'll discuss it a bit more at length a little later in this class, but there's one thing that we need to realize right now and make a distinction, that light coming from the sun leaves the sun and comes to us. As we know, it takes 8 minutes about for the light of the sun to reach us here on Earth. But it's not like that with God's energy. Why is that? God's energy, if we're going to try to understand it, is going to be more like sun rays in the sun. Now, if we think about that for a second, what are sun rays in the sun? They're simply part of what the sun is. That's what the sun is. The sun is, if you slice the sun open, will you see light over there? Yes. Every single part of the sun is light. Because what is light? Light is simply an expression. It's simply an emission. There's light being emitted from what the sun actually is. Everything emits what it is. Take, for example, a heater, a radiator, a steam. It emits heat. Why is that? It's because the thing itself is hot. If you have a metal radiator, it's emitting heat because the metal itself is hot, and that heat is coming out of the sun, out of that radiator. So in a sense, we can think of God's energy in this way. God's energy is an expression of what God actually is. And since God is infinite and pure and perfect, that expression is going to be exactly the same. It's going to be a reflection of exactly what that is. And again, we will be understanding this a bit better, but we do need to understand that with God, there's no division. There's no multiplicity. The sun rays are not going out of God. The sun rays always remain within God. And since it's like that, we can't really consider these sun rays as something separate from God. They're simply part of God. Think of what an expression of God is before it even leaves God. It's just God. So that expression of God is really just God. This is a bit of a deep topic, which takes some time, which we should take some time to think about to really understand what it means. And now let's think about that for a second. If God's energy is creating us and it's in us every single moment, and without it, we will disappear, what does that really mean? That means we exist within God because God's energy is within God. God's energy never leaves God. So now the question is, why, if so, do we feel like we just exist on our own? Think about the stone flying. The stone, you look at the stone, you see it flying up. You know that the stone doesn't have any energy of its own. You know that there's somebody who threw that stone upwards. And think about sunlight. You know that even sunlight which leaves the sun, you know that it's coming from the sun. So why is it that us humans, it's true that if we sit and think about it, we'll come to the calculation, we'll come to an understanding that there must be a beginning and that beginning must be coming from God. But why is it that we don't feel that God is within us if he's here within us, giving us energy all the time? So in order to understand that, we'll need to take a bit of a deeper look into this dynamic of God's energy and why it is hidden from us. And in order to understand that, Kabbalah teaches us about two names. There are two names of God. One of them, and I'm not going to pronounce any of them because they're sacred. One of them is the name which is spelled out with a yud, a hey, and a vav, and a hey, and that is the name which expresses God's infinity, which expresses God in its utter simplicity, utter purity, and infinite expression. And if indeed that expression of God would be revealed to us, if it would be felt within us, then we wouldn't feel us. We would just be part of that infinite expression of God. Imagine if our human bodies and our human experience, which is created and put together from multiple things, from many things, we have many body parts, we have neurons firing in our brains. All of our experiences, even this class, there's words involved and there's so much things. If God's pure infinite expression would be felt here within us, then there wouldn't be all of that multiplicity. There would just be God's utter expression here. So we wouldn't be able to feel that. But then there's another name of God, and that is Elohim. And I didn't fully pronounce it because the k is not really part of the word. I kind of changed it a bit because I'm not going to utter God's name in this venue. We only do that in prayer, etc. That name of God is the one that conceals God, that hides God from us so that we don't see and experience this infinite godly energy. So it turns out that one of God's names, in other words, God, an expression of God himself, because what is a name? A name is really an expression, how you express to others. Your name is how other people refer to you, etc. So God's expression, God has two types of expression. There's an expression which reveals his infinity, and then there's an expression which conceals his infinity, which we will be learning about in this class. But now let's focus on the infinite expression of God, the expression which is like light, like we were speaking about before. What is light? Light, let's think about it coming from the sun. It goes to all the same. The light doesn't differentiate who it's sending it to. The sun scatters its light through all of space equally, and it doesn't direct more light in one direction and less light in the other direction. Everything is, it's just, the sun is, so to speak, living its own life, so to speak. And all this light, all this expression of the sun is just going everywhere the same. There's no separation or differentiation. The sunlight expresses its source exactly as it is, and it's a complete reflection of the source. And with God, it's obviously in a much more perfect way. The infinity of God, the expression of God, is simply expressing what God actually is. So imagine, what is God? God is just the simple purity of everything. That's exactly what this expression of God is. So that's one way that God expresses himself. And we can actually think of understanding that with a mushal of a mirror. And a mushal, as we said before, is a metaphor, an example. So imagine looking at a mirror. What do you see in the mirror? You just see yourself, or whatever It's just reflecting exactly what is being shown to that mirror. That's what the mirror shows. That's what this reflection is. This reflection is showing exactly what God is. But then we have something which is called kalim. Kalim are generally translated as vessels. And as we mentioned before, there is two names of God. There is God's name, which represents his expression, his infinite expression, which expresses exactly what God is. And then there's another name of God, another expression of God, which conceals godliness. It makes it that we don't see it. And that's what brings forth something called kalim, these vessels. It's these things which filter and measure God's infinite energy to be able to be received by creations. So as we said before, there's the sunlight scatters everywhere equally. These kalim, these vessels, they're like receivers, they're like receptacles, they're like filters, which take this infinite godly energy and transform it to something which is receivable by a creation, by a non-infinite being, by a limited creation. And in the case of the sun, as we mentioned before, what perhaps can we envision these kalim, these filters as? We have the clouds which block the sun, we have layers of the atmosphere, but these again are things, so to speak, they're separate from the light coming from the sun. The sun on its own is shining its light to the entire space equally. But we have something which filters that infinite light and makes it more accessible to us. And then we live in our homes, and we have windows and window shades. This way we can measure how much of the sunlight we want to bring in. And all of this is something which is called Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum means concealment and contraction. And this is the process of how God's infinite energy, God's infinite expression, becomes more minute, becomes smaller, becomes more measured in order to come and give life to creation, to physical and limited creations like us. And this is how we, in our human experiences, live our daily lives, and we don't feel Hashem's power. And Hashem means the name, and it refers to God. This is how we can live our daily lives and not feel godliness within us. And as we said, that is because, true, God is creating us from his infinite energy, but that infinite energy is filtered, and it's concealed, and it's hidden through these different layers. And what are these infinite layers? What are these layers which hide and conceal God, which create more concealment over God? For those of you who are familiar with this channel, you already know that there are the 10 Sefirot, which are these 10 stages in which God's energy becomes smaller, so to speak, becomes more filtered, becomes more accessible to us, goes from being an infinite expression of godliness to something which can be expressed and brought into a limited being. And there are many different stages. Here we see 4 of them, but then there are other ones now. So what did we speak about until here? We spoke about, we have God creating the world every single second. He's creating us from his infinite energy, from his infinite expression of himself. And what is that infinite expression? It's exactly what God is. And that's what's creating us every moment. Now that infinite energy is within God. There's nothing outside of God. Everything is within God. So the question is, how do we feel ourselves as limited existences? How do we feel ourselves? How are we conscious? How do we each have a separate consciousness? And the answer was that there's this expression of God which limits and which conceals and which filters that infinity in order for us to be able to exist. So there's God's infinite energy giving us life, and then there's the filter, which makes that life something which we can understand. But now we have a question. And what's that question? The question is, doesn't this create multiplicity within God? We're saying that all of this exists within God, and we just said that there's 2 names over here. We said that there's God's infinite expression, and we said that there's an expression of God which limits. And really, God has more names, and these names really are expressions, and some of them manifest in the 10 Sefirot. They're all different types of expressions of godliness. And we're saying that all of this is happening within God. We said that it's not happening outside of God. So does that mean that God is not unified? That there's multiplicity within God? The answer is not at all. And why is that? That is because this tzimtzum, this filtration process, is a one-way tzimtzum. To God, there is no tzimtzum. There is no concealment. To God, God is here within us in a completely infinite form. There is no concealment to God. It's just that we, as creations, we don't see God's infinity everywhere. But in truth, there is just one thing everywhere, within our hands, within our phones, within our computers, within the radio waves which are connecting us, the internet wires, etc., the light, our tables and our chairs, everything, all this multiplicity really is just one, godliness. And God sees that. That's all that God sees. To us, it seems as if God is not here. Now, how exactly does this make sense? I mean, it sounds good on paper, but how exactly does this make sense? The answer is a mashal from a teacher. So here we have Mr. Albert Einstein, which is known for being a very smart, wise, and famous scientist. And over here, we have on top of him, this is another very wise man. His name is the Rogachover. Extremely genius, wrote very deep concepts on everything. So think about these extremely wise people trying to explain an idea to somebody else, to a student. How exactly do they have this idea in their mind? They understand it very well. How exactly are they going to explain it to a student? So the way they explain it is by putting it into words, by first of all thinking for a moment. How exactly is that student going to understand it? What does that student know? What does that student not know? How exactly, based off that information, will I be able to teach this information to that student? Which parts of it will that student be able to understand? And then he can put it into words and explain it to that student. Now, words are going to be something which is outside. I'm taking my idea, putting it into words, which is something outside of me, and then giving it over to that student. That's why you're able to write a book with an idea, because the book doesn't really have your idea in it. The book has the words which your idea was, so to speak, placed within. But the physical idea is not there. When that student will read this book, when anybody else reads this book, they're going to be understanding the words from their perspective, and they're going to be building the idea in their mind on their own. Your actual idea is not going to go over to that person. But what about when this teacher is trying to figure out a way of how he will explain to that student this idea? So within the teacher is, so to speak, beginning to find these filters and these explanations and these concealments of his great idea in order to give that over to the student. So what's going on over here? The teacher has within his mind all these concealments, all these things which are hiding and concealing over his idea. Now, did at any moment this teacher not understand this idea while he was explaining it in his mind to the student? No. There was, so to speak, an illusion happening in the teacher's mind in where he imagines what it's like to be somebody who doesn't understand this idea. But really, the teacher does understand it. He understands everything. He understands it very well. And this is a metaphor for how God is creating this world. And there's all these concealments, but God is still here in a unified fashion. And there's nothing else separate from God. Because it's all happening within God, as we were saying. It's like the infinite energy of God within God, like the light of the sun inside the sun. It's like this idea inside the teacher's mind. We're all existing. We all exist inside of God. But we don't see that. And why is that? Because we exist within the idea as it is concealed, but all inside, so to speak, the mind of God. Now, this might sound very weird and perhaps very frightening. What does that mean? We're an imagination of God? So it's not quite, because it's true that the way we were giving this illusion, the way we were presenting this metaphor is from a wise person. But again, that's a metaphor, how we can understand it in our human experience. So it's a human being which has an idea in their mind, which they're concealing and trying to explain it to somebody else. But with God, that's how God creates us. God is creating us within his own infinite truth. And he's concealing all of this infinite truth in order for us to be able to exist, in other words, so to speak, understand ourselves, perceive ourselves as separate things, and understand ourselves and look at ourselves in a limited way, while all the time existing within godliness. And this is obviously something which only God has the power to do. And we have another question over here from Nibin M. Sabu. See, the questions are really coming in strong. Thank you, everybody, for asking these questions. I love this type of interaction. So what is the actual purpose of Tzimtzum? What is the actual purpose of God's concealing himself? That concealment is, so to speak, in order to bring us into existence. Without this Tzimtzum, without God concealing himself, without God hiding from us, we would not be able to exist because we would see God's infinity everywhere. But I guess if you're asking why, are you asking what the purpose of creation is? The purpose of the concealment, the purpose of this, so to speak, metaphorical removal of God's infinity from existence is in order for us to be able to exist, as we were saying at the beginning of this class. Obviously, the most ideal scenario in which we can have this questions and answers type of situation is where we can see each other. Like if we have like a Zoom call or something, we have to arrange something like that. Yeah, we actually do offer that. If you want, you can check out our buymeacoffee.com pages or Patreon, where we do have membership tiers where we will have live conversations, where we will be able to ask your questions live, and we can have a one-on-one, fully understandable correspondence. Okay, then. Thank you, everybody, for stopping by. Thank you for joining. I hope you guys enjoyed this class, and hope to see you again next time.